episode, I am going to have the privilege of bringing you the methods and the methodology behind how do you size a ring up. In this case, it requires enough of a sized up that we have to add a piece of gold, and that's where the real work comes in. We're going to show you the different various methods of how to do that, and we're going to get right to it right now. What we have to work with today is very simple. We have the ring that needs to be sized up. It is currently a size 5, and the job requires us to make it a size 7. And over here, we have our previously fabricated piece of gold that is the correct size that we need to do that job. We just have to measure off the correct length needed to add to the other piece, and it is as simple as that. Now, I've been doing this long enough that I pretty much eyeball distances when it comes to millimeters. There's 2.5 millimeters to a finger size, and that's a neat little tidbit of information you can always use, see how much people's knowledge is. And so a size, to go up 2 sizes, that requires 5 millimeters of metal. Now, most goldsmiths will actually measure off that amount, and I recommend doing the same if you just don't have a good eye for that sort of thing. So to do that, I think we all grew up going to school using a calipers and a millimeter gauge. So knowing that we need to have a 5 millimeter piece of gold, we're going to use this to mark off 5 millimeters and in a length with the sharp points. Then we're going to drag this across that bar of gold, creating those lines that'll give us that 5 millimeter size piece that we need. As you can see, we have our 2 markings from our calipers, and we have pulled it down a little from the end because if you notice there's a little porosity, a little bubble there at the end from making the piece. So we want to make sure we get a good clean piece of gold. So therefore I have to make 2 cuts, get the ends nice and flat the way I need them, and then what we're going to do is we're going to heat up our old ring. The reason being that any old solder marks from the piece, and being that it's a size 5 and most rings start off as a size 6 or 6.5, it may have been sized down, and to determine that is very important because you want to be able to put and cut through that same place where it was soldered before. Okay, so I have applied the heat without using any of the chemicals, which causes that darker oxidation, and it causes a separate color when there's solder and has been soldered before. And as you can see, this area right in there, that little color, that little miscolor, a little different than the rest, well, that tells me right there that it has been sized down, and that is where we need to cut through. By cutting through it, you can tell it popped open a little bit. That tells me that there was already tension building up in the shank. And over time, that's what causes your ring to pop, so to speak, which you know of or heard someone else's ring popping open. Well, that's what happens. It's a work hardening event at the solder joint. All right, let's put it on the mandrel. And going up 2 sizes on the mandrel, we know that we want it to open up to the point where it says size 7. And so what we do is we just keep pushing it up the mandrel. And in this kind of ring, it moves fairly easily. But if you get a wide man's ring, it's a whole nother art to be able to open it up enough. So you actually turn it around and do it from both sides, or else it's going to create a slight angle in the shank, even on a ring this thin. All right, now we normally will do this over the bench to catch every bit of that gold dust, but I wanted to make sure you saw that process. So we are going to make sure that that gold dust makes it back into the drawer. Over time, that adds up. All right, so we have sawn off our piece of gold from the stock that we created. Now we're going to try to fit it as close as we can into the opening we made so that both sides are as flush as possible with as little gap in between so that that solder flows right in there and creates a solidly built weld. By making the piece a little bigger than needed allows us to be able to really find a center point much quicker. And that way, we're not cutting it so close that we end up having to make the shank thinner than it was originally, and that's where a lot of goldsmiths go wrong. So I made the piece a little bigger than needed. That way I can center, as you can see, the shank right kind of in the middle of the sizing stock, and that way I am sure to cover what is required without thinning down the rest of it to make it to match. All right, I've selected the solder that I need, which is a very hard white gold welding solder. It's actually 19 karat. So what that gives us is a very solid joint. It's one that most likely will not pop. And being that white gold is a metal that can be work hardened easily, it's better to use a higher carat, less likely also to have pitting in that solder joint. Being that this is a 19 karat solder, it's a higher flow temperature, so we need a little bit of a hotter torch than we might normally use if we were working with just yellow gold. Now you notice this is a sapphire. If there was any other gemstone, I would be putting it in water or another material that would prevent heat from getting to it. This sapphire that far away from the source of heat is not going to affect it in any way, even if it was a no heat sapphire. It just would not get hot enough. But any gemstone other than corundum, any temperature could damage the stone. All right, so let's check on the inside to make sure that our solder flowed through, and I see that it has. It may not be too pretty right now, but we're going to sand and grind all that back to where it matches the original shank, and let's see just how well I do that. All right, so we're getting kind of close to where we should be in a pre-finishing stage. And we want to check our size at this point because any adjustments from here will put back in some tool issues, tool marks that we would just have to sand out again. So this is a good stopping point. Let's verify the size. And if we're close to the size that we need it to be, then we can continue on. As we put it on the mandrel, you can see that here is our goal target right there, a 7, and you always want to rotate it down because your finger doesn't know, it will conform to the inside of the ring. So you want to make sure that you get the entire size out of it, and by twisting it down, it will take any egg shape, yep, look at that, out of it, even though this one is able to become perfectly round. There we have the exact 7 mark. Any other little bit of adjustments don't matter. That little bit of a difference won't. But we have a little bit of finishing on the inside of the piece left, and then it'll finish at the exact mark. All right, we want to get a wheel that does the inside of the ring. And it's a sandpaper wheel. As you can see, sandpaper can be peeled off to get to fresh grit if needed. always like to bevel my edge so it doesn't create that sharp feeling that so many different clients of mine have commented about it, with feeling a sharp edge. And over time, I've realized exactly what they mean by that. So even a little bit of a beveled edge, whether it's in wood or in your ring, it does soften the finish and make it a more comfortable feel. All right, one more wheel, and you're going to see a big difference between the grit of that wheel and this one. And this is pretty much a pre-polish. Also, this particular grit in this wheel I like because it will not damage softer stones. And I've instructed many goldsmiths to switch over to using these wheels versus files. And it prevents a lot of damage that winds up happening to stones that they don't realize are too soft to use a lot of different files on. We'll use a wheel to polish the inside, and then we're done with the bench part. So I have a brush wheel, and here we go. Now, there you have it. And look at that. I mean, that is as pretty much as well matched as you can expect when you're adding two whole sizes of metal. Now, you saw how kind of lumpy and distorted it was to begin with, but look how it is transformed into a finished piece that you can't tell where and how it's even been added, and that's the way it's supposed to look. All right, let's clean it up. And there we go. We've rhodium plated it, we've steamed it. It is a finished work of art as far as I'm concerned. Sizing it 2 sizes up. Look at that. Just like it was custom made for you. And that's what we like to do here, and that's what it takes. It's a lot of effort. If it looked easy, of course, you're talking about 40 years bench experience I have. So maybe I made it look that way. A lot goes into it to do it right. And now I hope you have a better appreciation. And now you have been behind the bench, and now you have seen how do you size a ring up.